it's rather interesting because we've been looking at what Solomon said as far as trying to find a meaning and purpose for life. And he went through Ecclesiastes telling us everything he had discovered, everything that he experienced, and he came to the conclusion that the only thing was that he believed that God was knowable, that he could be found, that God gives meaning and purpose. However, in 2022, we have generations of people who have never heard about the God of the Bible. Or if they have, they've just added him to their collection of gods. But in our modern day and age, I wonder how much relevance that God really has. How important is God to us? And it's interesting, I found in the last census, 2021, the Bureau of Statistics revealed a section, if you remember filling it in, what your religion were, no religion, etc. And in that, it says it refers to a broad group of secular beliefs, other spiritual beliefs, and people who have no religious affiliations. The survey identified people with no religion and those with non-religious beliefs, including atheism, agnosticism, and humanism. The survey noted other religions, which included Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Aboriginal traditional religions, Chinese and Indian religions, and these were the following statistics that they, I didn't put it up, but they released. It says that Christianity decreased by more than 1 million people, and yet Australia is considered a Christian nation. Other religions continued to increase. Almost 10 million Australians reported as having no religion whatsoever. That's nearly half of basic Australians. The number of atheists in 2016 went from 32,300 to 37,800. The number of agnostics went from 26,390 to 31,680. Combining no religion with other cults in 2016 was 7,040,720 people. That went to 9,886,960 people. So Australia is becoming less Christian in its philosophies and its thinking. It's been estimated there are 2.5 billion Christians living in the world in 2022. It means that Christianity is the largest religion, followed by Islam with 1.5 billion followers in the world. Solomon, the wisest man in the world, says God is knowable. What then is our problem in 2022? Why aren't people finding him? And I guess the question that went through my mind is, if I want a God and I want to look for God, how would I know that I've found him? What am I looking for? If I'm looking and searching for a God, what am I looking for? What would you be looking for? What would he be like? Or what would he have to be like? Design him for me. Give me your want list. What would God have to be like? Loves me? Anything else? Come on, this is your opportunity. Design your God. Well, wouldn't it have to be somebody that does what I tell him to do? Grants me my wishes when I want? No? What sort of God should I have? Or what God do I want? We say, yes, we know the God of the Bible is like this, this, and this. But how we live actually is our reflection of what we think about our God. And sometimes we think our God's there to do our bidding, Rub his tummy 3 times and he grants you 3 wishes. He's not like that. But is our God knowable? And one of the things we have to find out, I believe, is a discussion about culture. And we're looking at Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 21 this morning. But what is culture? Not a different religion. Culture is a shared frame of reference for interacting with one another, for interpreting the world in which we live. So culture's important, isn't it? Yes, it is important. And another idea that I found was this. Culture is what you see, taste, smell, visible signs, source of stereotypes, norms, how I should behave, values, how I aspire to behave. Like breathing, you don't even think about it. And I could have gone into a whole lot of what culture is. But I found the best and most simplest definition of culture is this. Culture in its simplest definition is simply what we do with what God has made. It's what human beings do with the created world, the natural world, and the resources God has given us. That's the best. And one of the commentators that I came across gave some insights about how we as Christians, how do we engage our culture? Now, what do I mean, how do we engage our culture? Very simply, how do I talk to people? How do you talk to people? What do you say to them when you meet them? And particularly as a Christian. For a Christian, I must start with a biblical culture, biblical theology of culture. And this definition is probably the best one. And when I pick up my Bible, does the Bible have a lot to say about the world? Does it have a lot to say about God who made this world and how we're to live? If I put it simply, culture is what we do with what God has made. Now, that might be a problem if you don't believe God made anything or created anything, that you evolved or you just happened to be here. That's going to be a problem. But from a biblical perspective, it's understanding what we're to do with God has made. We need to recognize that culture is also a gift from God. It's not something that we should fear. It's not something we oppose. But culture, in part, is of the goodness of creation. There is in Scripture what is called a cultural mandate for us to exercise dominion over the created world. And what that means is to take the resources that God has given and use them for the glory of God, but also the good of one another. That is what we're supposed to do. From a biblical perspective, we understand that our culture and every culture in the world is fallen. As well as the doctrine of creation, what does the Bible say happened to mankind? It says that mankind fell into sin. And that impacts our culture. It impacts every culture. The culture around us, as we look at it, as we look at people, as we look at things, there's going to be a mixture of good things and there's going to be a mixture of bad things. And we need to exercise great discernment to be able to tell the difference between a God-honouring culture and a God-dishonouring culture. We recognise that all culture is religious in nature because all culture reflects some sort of value system. So even secular culture, and we talk about it a lot, even a secular culture, in fact, is deeply religious at its heart. So there's no such thing as religious neutrality in culture of any kind. We all have a bias towards one thing or another. It's always there. So we can't separate ourselves from culture. We can't isolate ourselves from culture because we're affected by culture that's all around us. It affects us, but we also affect the culture around us, better or worse. What we bring, what we take, we add to that culture. And we need to view culture through the lens of the Great Commission. There are many things that we are called to do as Christians, to serve God in this world. But the Great Commission, the great calling to take the good news of Christ to the nations, to make disciples of nations, to bring the teaching of Christ to the nations, and to build up the church, as a Christian, that should be our priority. And in the way that we relate to our culture can help us in fulfilling the Great Commission in some ways, but it also can hinder us as well. And I think it's important as Christians to recognise that the Great Commission is our priority. It's an important lens through which we think about our relationships with others around us. And thinking about this, the unknown God. How many people in our society today know who God is? Have you stopped and asked somebody, can you tell me who God is? Who you think God is? Because it's marvellous, some of the ideas that people think God is, and who and what he is. But there's quite an ignorance concerning who God is. And our passage this morning, Paul deals with the unknown God. The unknown God, and he engages himself in the culture that he's around. And the involvement, as we see in verse 16, while Paul was waiting for Silas and Timothy in Athens, he was troubled because he saw the city was full of idols. So here we have the Apostle Paul. He's gone to Athens. He's waiting for Silas and Timothy. And so he's arrived. What is he to do while he waits? We're told that he arrived by ship, landed at a place called Piraeus, and would have entered Athens by the double gate on the west side of the city, a place where the 4 highways connected to that city. As he passed through the gates, he would have been hit by the temple of Demeter, the statues of goddess and her daughter. He moved forward a short way. He would have seen the statue of Poseidon hurling his trident. And then as he continued his walk through the city, he saw the statues of Athena, Zeus, Apollo, Hermes standing near the sanctuary of Dionysus. In that time, he further explored the city. He would have seen the royal colonnade, the sanctuary of the Mother of Gods with her image. He went to the central market. He's confronted by the altar of mercy standing in olive groves. Nearby, a stone statue of Hermes, then a bronze statue of Polymene. Then he would have seen the most famous Greek temple, the Parthenon. So here we have the Apostle Paul entering the city, and whichever way he looked, left, right, whatever direction, he was confronted by idols. In every temple, every home, every street corner, there were gods and demigods. Everywhere. People had gods. And he was concerned for the people of Athens. One has said, by someone living at the time, there were more gods in Athens than there were men. So it gives you an idea of the idols and gods that were worshipped by the people in Athens. And as Paul viewed all these gods, as he wandered about the city, he came across this altar to an unknown God. In all the gods that were there, he came across this altar It just says, to an unknown God. Why would you build an altar to some unknown God? Somebody you didn't know. Why build him an altar? And I don't know whether the following statement is from myth or legend, but we have a 3rd century writer who tells of a story of a plague that took place in Athens nearly 1,000 years earlier. He says that a magician ended the plague by bringing a herd of sheep into Athens and releasing them. Each sheep was followed, and when it lay down, it was sacrificed to the god whose temple was in the area of that city. Now, according to the legend, a sheep lay down in an area where there was no temple, and so they made an altar and sacrificed that sheep to an unknown god. Just where the sheep lay, oh, unknown god, we build an altar. We don't have any historical records of the event, but it sounds pretty reasonable. But I guess my point is, here is the Apostle Paul. He's in a city surrounded by gods of every nature and description, and among them, he is an unknown God. But he's sorry to see the condition and state of the people. He's troubled by what he sees. What could he do? He's only one person in a large city of Athens. What could he do? Well, he could have decided, hey, it's none of my business. I don't want to get involved. It's not what I'm here for. Let them get on with it. It's their problem if they got gods to everyone. He could have remained neutral. He could have thought, well, I'm just a tourist, I'm visiting here, and decided to do nothing. But you know, Paul would not have seen anything if he hadn't walked around with his eyes open. And I think the challenge, as I was thinking about it, is, what do we think of our community? What do we think of our nation? Are we concerned about what we see? Are we concerned about where people are headed? You see, Paul walked around. We can't walk around with our heads in the sand without understanding that something is happening around us. In other words, we need to engage with people. We need to engage in culture. We need to talk to them. We need to be concerned about them and the things that we see. Now, what things do we worship in Australia? What do people worship? I mean, if I go outside here, I'm not going to see a statue out here. I'm not going to look down the street and see statues in every home. But are Australians any different in their worship of things? Well, that's helpful. Are we? Well, what sort of idols? What's happening this afternoon in Sydney? What are they hoping will fill an auditorium or a stadium and have people just sitting there mute? What are they hoping to see? They're hoping to see a stadium full of people who are passionate about following their teams, who will pay the prices, who will deck themselves out. If you've seen the pictures on the news of the Penrith and Parramatta supporters everywhere, homes done up, what are they showing? They're showing their support. But you know what? It's bordering on worship. Even to get tattoos, even to get their hair done, even to have sausages done in blue and gold. I don't know what they taste like. But you know, Australia worship last weekend. It was worship. Who won? See, it's only a week and we've got trouble remembering who even played. 10 years, we won't even remember unless we look it up. But you know, there's the passion, there's the following of heroes and what they do. But Australia is also worshipping the environment. It's where we worship Mother Nature. We don't want to upset her. It's taking control of the environment to exact some change so that we can please her by what we do. And you know, these things we can go on and on. But we're not much different to the Athenians in that we have something in our homes we worship, things in which we trust and pay homage to. Are we burdened, like Paul, by the condition and the needs that we see of the people around us? Are we determined to do anything about it? And the question is, if we are, where do we start? Paul's in a big city. He's a stranger there. He doesn't live there. He's concerned about what he sees. So where does he start? And that's often the question that we are to ask ourselves. The involvement in verse 17, in the synagogue he talked with the Jews and Greeks who worship God. He also talked every day with people in the marketplace. Now I want to say here, Paul didn't sit down and think, oh, what am I going to do? I'm concerned about these people. How do I reach them? He went to a meeting place. And that was the synagogue. He didn't do anything out of the ordinary. This was something he did always. He visited a city. He went to the synagogue. And he wasn't out of place. In fact, he was quite comfortable in the synagogue. He was able to connect to the Jews and Greeks alike as they gathered to worship God. He connected with them. He was an expert in Jewish law. He was comfortable enough in Jewish culture. We could say he's in his comfort zone. He could connect to the people that were there very well. He also understands Greek culture enough to be confident to engage them in meaningful conversations. But he met at a place where people of like mind gathered together, much as what we're doing this morning in worshiping God. He could connect to them, and he felt comfortable with them. And many of us are comfortable being with other Christians. We can talk about the things of the Lord. But Paul wasn't satisfied with just being in the synagogue. Now, if I'd been in Paul's place, I would have been very happy to stay where I'm confident about the people I know. I know the people and the place, and I can connect with them. I wouldn't be going any further. I would be wanting to stay there. But that's not on Paul's mind. He had a burden for people outside his comfort zone. And he knew, if I'm to connect with the people outside this environment, it means I'm going to have to go places where they would be. And our scriptures tell us this meant the marketplace. The marketplace. It would mean that you'd have to have one-on-one conversations with individuals. And if you have one-on-one conversations with people, maybe you're going to draw attention to yourself. Maybe people are going to challenge you. Maybe some of them are going to debate you. Maybe some of them are going to argue with you. But you know, Paul put himself in a place where he could connect with people, where he would engage them, because his desire was, his motivation was, these people need to hear the message of salvation. And I'm here. I need to do something about it. Now, that meant he had to take risks. He had to step outside his comfort zone. He had to cross all sorts of barriers, racial, social barriers that existed even in that day. He had to make himself vulnerable, and he had to, I believe, allow himself to be uncomfortable. Now, I don't know about you, but many people are uncomfortable when they start to talk to people about the Lord. You know? You go outside and you meet someone, hey, can I talk to you about the Lord? Yeah, right. And we worry about what people might say or think if we do that. But that's what Paul is saying. If I want to connect with the people are not going to come into the church. They're not going to come into the synagogue. We have to go out to them and connect with them where they're at. Now, the other interesting thing I found, he used his own initiative. He could have sat and waited for Silas and Timothy to get there before they decided what to do, but he didn't. He took hold of the things that were there, and nobody said, Paul, you know what? It's your responsibility to go and reach these people for the Lord. Now go and do it. He didn't have to be told. He used his initiative. He didn't sit back and wait for others to come up with some sort of idea or some motivational speech to get him going. He took it upon himself and he decided to connect with people. And I wonder, do we need the challenge? Am I prepared to step out of my comfort zone to connect and reach the lost? Or have I reached a point in my life where, hey, I don't care. I'm too scared to do that, so I wouldn't know what to say to them anyway. Yet today, in our modern world, there are so many ways for us to engage and connect with people about the gospel. Now, I'm not asking you to go down to the Rapid Creek markets when we're finished. I'm not asking you to go over to the markets at Nightcliff, pull out your soapbox and start banging people over the head with the Bible. I'm not asking you to do that. I'm not asking you to stand on every corner and preach the gospel. But I am saying we have many ways to reach and connect with our culture. Many of us today, not myself so much, but we connect through social media platforms. Many are engaged in Facebook. Many are engaged in Twitter. Many are engaged in email and internet. Many use WhatsApp, where we can share the messages of salvation. And you know what? You don't have to wait to be told to do it. We can do it. And many, particularly the younger ones, this is a way in which you can engage your culture. It's a way in which you connect to people. But do we have a burden to connect and engage with people? To get involved with them because we care about their spiritual condition? And this is what Paul was. He took the step to get involved. He wanted to be involved. And so he went to the marketplace where everybody gathered. Now, our next point is this, is the interaction. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers argued with him, saying, this man doesn't know what he is talking about, what he's trying to say. Others say he seems to be telling us about some other gods, because Paul was telling them about Jesus and his rising from the dead. Here we find Paul in the marketplace. He's presenting the gospel about Jesus Christ. And what does he encounter? Some people who probably thought he was nuts. He doesn't know what he's talking about. What he says doesn't make sense. It's foolishness to them. But here were people who pushed their own ideas and agenda, and they mocked anybody who would oppose them. They loved to have an audience. They loved to have people listen to them, hear their latest ideas and opinions. They would get feedback. Then they would try to persuade people of new ideas and engage them in conversation in the marketplace through debates. Here comes Paul. He enters into the debate. Our text indicates that through the debate, these philosophers couldn't understand what Paul was talking about. They seemed confused and alarmed. He was introducing some new God who rose from the dead, and this was something they wouldn't allow themselves to entertain. Now, I just want to spend a short time talking about the Stoics and Epicureans, who they were and their belief systems. Stoicism was an ancient school of thought that taught people to accept life as it comes and cultivate some virtues to lead to a meaningful life. Anything wrong with that statement? Would you agree with it? I think it's got a lot of merit. We would agree with them in many respects. Their belief system was based on self-control and the courage to overcome all destructive emotions in the mind. It was not a set of rules or beliefs. It's a way of living that involves training and the practice of reason and logic based on natural laws that lead to the goal of living a good life. That means learning to live with nature. It means using reason and logic to respond accordingly. That means our thoughts, our actions, judgments, and speech, that's our responsibility. We control them in the way that we use them. That's our responsibility. So what am I not responsible for as a Stoic? Very simply, the things I cannot control. Now, what things cannot I control? Death? I don't know when that's going to happen, so out of my control. Anything else? Well, the things I cannot control, according to them, death, reputation, money, wealth, and health. What other people say and think about us. You live your life to the best you can, controlling the things you can control, while accepting the things that happen to you are outside your control, and you live with the results. You're only accountable to yourself and nobody else. Sound familiar? The point of Stoicism is to accept the world as it is and act accordingly. It's what it is. I must adapt to survive and live a good life. Stoics believed that the world was driven by a natural law. They assumed that people had no capacity to shape or deal with what happens. Their attitude was, you might as well accept it, because if you can't change, just grin and bear it. The Epicureans were different. They saw things differently. They believed in some God, but they believed that he separated himself from the affairs of men and was disinterested in what they did. Their goal in life, the pursuit of happiness and everything that pertains to achieving it. They thought pleasure was the highest goal in life. They believed and practiced situational ethics as a way of life. If people agree and no one gets hurt, it's okay, do it. The question is, how does a person in the real world come to make those decisions? This philosophy and approach to ethics assumes, hey, people are going to stop and think about all the consequences of their actions before they do them. Have you found that to be true in life? Before you do something, you say, hang on a minute, I better think of all the consequences before I do it. You do that? I don't meet many people that will stop and think about the consequences before they do anything. Because the reality is, people who engage in this type of behaviour act in the heat of the moment. They rely on their feelings more than logic, more than common sense, and they have no idea, or they don't care about the consequences of what they're doing. They just want to do it, and they're going to do it. Which brings us to the bottom line. What is the source of all this reason and logic? Where does it come from? Do they come, as the Stoics believe, from the laws of nature? Do they come from man's intellect, as the Epicureans believed? Or are they given by a just and loving God as Paul asserted in his debate with them. Now, the Stoic and Epicurean philosophies have been around for a long, long time, and we are still dealing with their philosophy even in modern times, just under different names. The teaching of evolution teaches, what does it teach? Who's in control of this world? Who's in control of your destiny? Now, if you believe evolution, who's in control? You are. Man is in charge of his own destiny. He rules over everything he sees because there is no God. They don't believe there is a God. Science, logic, reason would tell us if there was a God. There is no God, he's a myth. So man can do whatever he likes. Today we see the push for climate change, green energy, the worship of nature itself that will destroy us if we don't change our world by stop using certain resources that are available. Stoicism. The Western world's pursuit after pleasure and leisure is insatiable. I just want to be happy. You're entitled to be happy. You don't allow anyone or anything to stand in your way of happiness because you deserve it. You deserve the me time that's yours. People are intent on getting what they can because they can. It's about me and what I want. It's not about community. It's not about others. Epicureanism. Just a different name. But we have it today in our society. And it is there. And it is affecting us. This is where we find people in our culture embracing it, proclaiming it. Into the middle of this is where the Christian steps. It's where the Christian finds himself or herself being drawn into these philosophies and debates. What do I do? What do I say? Now, the reality is we're being drawn into these debates. I shouldn't call them debates because people don't want to debate it. They just want to accept it. But you and I find ourselves drawn into these philosophies. We have people espousing these very things. And we wonder, what do I say, or should I say anything? And I want us to spare a thought for the Apostle Paul, because he found himself in such a situation. And as a result, he was misunderstood because the people didn't hear and want to hear about this unknown God. They already had their agendas. They were already pushing them. They didn't want to be engaged in dealing with an unknown God. And we find the interest in verses 19 through 21. They got Paul, took him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said, "Please explain to us this new idea you've been teaching. The things you were saying are new to us, and we want to know what this teaching means." All the people of Athens and those from other countries who lived there always used their time to talk about the newest ideas. Now, what I want us to see is, Paul went to the marketplace. He had an impact. And he made an impact on the people that were there. They listened to him. You see, Paul had a knack of getting people's attention, a knack of getting them to talk about what was happening in the marketplace. But there was a good deal of misunderstanding about what he said as well. He had been teaching about Jesus rising from the dead. And the people thought he was talking here about a new God rising from the dead, about a new God and goddess named Jesus and Anastasia. That's what they thought. Jesus and Anastasia, a god and goddess. That was their culture. That was their thinking. That was their understanding. And it seems rather ironic in a city like Athens, which was so full of different gods and religions that they passed a law that stopped the introduction of any new gods and goddesses unless they got official approval from the city leaders. So here's a law that says you cannot add and talk about any new god and goddesses unless the city fathers have approved it. So here was Paul talking about Jesus, and they thought he was talking about Jesus and a goddess, Anastasia. And so they were wondering and couldn't understand who this goddess and goddess was. And it appears that Paul had fallen foul of this law. Unusual as it was that someone in the marketplace, which is possibly not unusual in today's marketplace, was offended by what Paul said and laid a complaint against him. Now, a text says they got Paul. In other words, they took hold of him and took him to the Areopagus, and this is a place where matters of judgment were made to determine if any laws had broken. It's not a criminal trial. It's to see whether a person was guilty of breaking any laws. And Paul is asked, hey, explain yourself. And they had all these city leaders, and they were asking him, look, who is it that you're talking about? We're fascinated. At the same time, they're very wary of what he presented. What Paul was saying was new to them. They wanted more information because they wanted to be part of this new teaching and see how they could benefit from it. See, they're listening and saying, how can we use this? How can we promote it? How can we make use of it ourselves? Now, Paul's not on trial. There's no formal charge. There's no verdict to be given. It's simply an inquiry or investigation to see if Paul broke any laws and was guilty of breaching any of the laws that they had. Now, one commentator said, in the northwest of the city of Athens, Greece, a small hill is covered in stone seats. This area was once used as a forum for the rulers of Athens to hold trials, debate, and discuss important matters. And the location was called Areopagus, a combination of the Greek words for the god of war and stone. Literally means Ares rock. The equivalent to Ares in Roman mythology is Mars, and that's where we get Mars Hill. This is what it was known. But here in chapter 17, it refers to a group of Athenian leaders and thinkers who met on the hill. And they had the purpose much like that of a Jewish Sanhedrin. They were made up of all groups, Stoics, Epicureans, and other people and leaders in the culture who would gather together to discuss any philosophical or spiritual arguments that were presented. These Athenians primarily were interested in defending the Greek culture and concept of gods. They had their gods, and they made a decision whether you could add or take away. And so when he began speaking his teaching here, he gained attention. While this council was involved in criminal trials, prosecution does not seem to have been the purpose. Rather, they asked Paul to present this new teachings. Now, Paul's presence there was not one of hostility. It was not one of offense. It was one of interest. Paul used this opportunity in this place of judgment to deliver one of the New Testament's most dynamic moments of evangelism. And we're going to see that next week. The challenge for us today: how do we prepare ourselves and engage ourselves in our culture, in everyday life? In other words, how do we connect to the people that we meet and work with in everyday life? People we work with, people at school, people at sport, people who are our next door neighbours, people in the shopping centre. How do we meet and connect with them? Are we prepared to meet with them? Or are we scared to open our mouths because we're too concerned about how they would think about us and what they would think about us? We're too concerned about the trends and happenings that surround us to open our mouths and let people know what we believe. Are we concerned about what our children and our grandchildren are being exposed to today? If not, we should. We really should. In our day and age, people are chasing and pursuing after happiness, seeking meaning and answers to life, but they're looking in the wrong places and being fed so much misinformation. What do you and I do about that? What should we do about that? Now, I'm not going to tell you now, because you have to come back next week and find out what Paul did. But you can read what he did. But I guess the challenge that I'm saying is that it's no good for us to sit back and complain about how life is going, about all these decisions being made, if we do not connect and discuss with people in our culture. People, I won't say are ignorant, but they don't do their own research or homework. They just accept the opinions that are being propagated through media as their own. And yet when they're challenged concerning what that actually means, they stop and think about it. You know, we as Christians, if we have a biblical perspective, if we have a biblical theology, we're in the best position and have the opportunity to point them in the right direction and challenge them. The problem is we're often too scared to open our mouths and identify ourselves as being Christian because of what people will say and think about us. The challenge is we need to engage with our culture. If we're going to challenge them, if we're going to make them think, we have to go outside these walls to do so. And we can do that, as I've said, through many different avenues. The challenge is, have we even thought about it? What way can God use me to connect me with people in my culture? In the Bureau of Statistics, they said that the most, I guess, challenged group that has nothing to do with Christianity are the 35 and under. And extremely, they pointed out to those between the ages of 10 and 19. They've been neglected. In other words, they've never heard the gospel. They've never been exposed to them. And many of them are growing up atheistic or agnostic. And yet, where is the church? What are we doing about it? How are we connecting with this generation and the generation that's coming through? We need to be connecting outside our comfort zone. We're here to encourage one another, but we can't stop here. Every day you and I meet and talk to people. And you know that we worry about what people think, but once they find out you're Christian, they have questions for you. And they really do have questions for you. Some, well, they might challenge you a little bit concerning your faith, but nonetheless, you've got an opportunity to share your faith, and maybe for the first time, they'll hear about the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. Next week, we'll have a look and see how Paul used that situation to connect with the Athenians as the team comes.